It's my great honour to have Felicitas Ross here, who is going to be our first speaker in this series. So Felicitas joined the Open University in 2022 and is a senior lecturer in psychology and counselling. And before joining the school, she worked at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation, training psychotherapists and supervising clinical doctorate students. Her research and teaching are in the field of mental health and psychotherapy, and she's also a psychodynamic psychotherapist and currently working as well in the charity sector. So it's been really great to have you here today, Felicitas, and I'm going to hand things over to you now and let you give your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Trina, for introducing me, and thank you so much for everyone attending this talk. It's an honor to be here and giving this first talk, and as my title suggests, I'm going to talk about how research knowledge and expertise addressed real-world issues and has sort of achieved significant impact on the NICE depression treatment guideline. And so what we were thinking of is that I will give a presentation for about 30-40 minutes and then have plenty of time for discussion and for questions, and yeah, do come in then. Write down your questions, and hopefully there's loads to discuss, and I look forward to that. Okay. Right, so for those of you who are not familiar with the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, I'll provide a brief summary. So NICE is an independent but government-funded body responsible for developing NHS health guidelines in England. Drawing on existing research and doing their own systematic reviews, NICE aims to develop evidence-based guidelines that improve the care of patients. They were established in 1999 to provide treatment recommendations for physical health problems. The first mental health guideline was developed in 2002 on the treatment of schizophrenia. Since then, 80 mental health and public health guidelines have been produced. And most importantly, treatments that NICE recommend, they get funded and offered in the NHS. And equally important, those treatments that do not get recommended are very unlikely to get funded and offered in the NHS, and obviously that is very important. However, NICE guidelines are not only used in England, but they're also internationally renowned and used, especially by countries who don't have their own treatment or guideline development. The NICE guidelines, therefore, are being used in many countries around the world. As NICE stresses themselves, stakeholder involvement is extremely important. So as they quote on their websites, stakeholder involvement is a vital part of the quality assurance and the peer review process, and that they form an integral part of the guideline development process. Any organization can register as a stakeholder, and they are invited to be involved at various stages. So, for example, they can make recommendations for new guidelines, or they can say when a guideline needs updating, but they also can comment on draft scope of a guideline, or most importantly, on a final draft version of a guideline before it is published. However, how NICE listened to stakeholders' comments differed tremendously in the past, and many of those involved in this process, at least those that I have talked to, have observed that it was often more of a tick box exercise rather than an integral part, as they've claimed to be. So, for example, in previous years, stakeholders' comments were not fully published on their website as they ought to be, and I believe they're now fully published, but it wasn't always the case. But most importantly, some of the issues that stakeholders have raised in the past with guidelines were not fully addressed. And the whole process is a funny process to some extent. especially when you compare it to guideline development in other countries. So, for example, a final version is only stakeholders are only allowed to read a final version once, and they're not given a lot of time. They're often given 4 weeks. They often fall on, over Christmas and so forth. And as you can imagine, a guideline of that, consists of considerable, numbers of pages. And, if you really scrutinize it, you need some time to do that. So the process in itself is quite surprising, and especially to us researchers, was very surprising that there is not more of a back and forth, really, as it is indeed in some other countries where there is, a bit more of a back and forth and several consultation periods on a guideline. But in the UK or in England, NICE has primarily only one consultation on a guideline that is ready to be published, in their view. So guidelines usually get updated every 5 to 10 years, but I've also heard that recently they're changing that, and they're updating, or they're aiming to update them more often. And but what I'm talking about is the guideline for depression in adults, and which was sort of due to my own interest. So as Trina sort of introduced me, I'm a psychotherapy researcher, primarily mental health, focusing on the treatment for severe depression, primarily psychological informed treatments. I'm also a therapist, so many of my clients, have experienced depression, and in that sense, are also impacted by a guideline like that. So in May 2022, NICE published its updated treatment guideline for depression in adults. The version before that was the 2009 version, so it was long due an update. So in 2022, they published it, but this followed a development process that lasted 7 years and resulted in an unprecedented 3 revisions. So the delay was due to the extraordinary persistence of a group of over 40 mental health organisations registered as stakeholders, supported by prominent UK MPs and peers who challenged NICE to address major methodological flaws in previous versions. So this has never happened before in any of the NICE guidelines. Never has a draft treatment guideline in the UK received so much scrutiny and detailed attention, and the final version of this guideline has therefore dramatically improved as a consequence. However, for me and for many of us in this sort of stakeholder coalition, it wasn't just an exercise in quality assurance and peer review process. It was actually vital that we did something, because we realized that if the guideline would have been published as it was, it would not have been fit for purpose. It would have led to misleading treatment recommendations and therefore potentially impede the care of thousands of people with various forms of depression in the UK and in many other countries in the world. So I was invited to give this talk to share this journey of this campaign that I spearheaded with you, and to talk about why we felt it was necessary to challenge some of NICE's methodological choices with this particular guideline, what we felt needed to be changed, how we managed the campaign, and what we achieved and what we did not achieve. So to begin with, I started by registering the Society for Psychotherapy Research UK chapter as a stakeholder. I was the president of the UK chapter at the time. I am the president of the overall organisation now, but at the time I was chairing the UK chapter, and I set up a working group. And I felt we were particularly placed within this organisation because all of the members, come from a position of therapeutic neutrality. But we also had methodological and statistical expertise. Most of us were practitioners too. So I thought, we as an organisation and our members were we're in a good position to review and comment on this draft guideline. However, having reviewed the draft guidelines when it came out over Christmas, with a scientific lens, we found ourselves extremely concerned. There were substantial inconsistencies in the document. There was a lack of transparency. And we were especially concerned with decisions, important decisions, concerning the selection, the grouping, and the analysis of the evidence. So we reached out to other stakeholders at that point to see if they felt similar and had also concerns. And on detecting that they actually did, we formed a coalition. To have a realistic aim, really, because we wanted to, obviously, NICE to listen to us and we wanted to achieve something. So to have a realistic aim, we reduced all our concerns to 6 key methodological flaws. There were many more, and very different aspects of the guideline that we pointed out in our formal responses. But overall, we focused on 6 methodological flaws that we raised and wanted NICE to address. I've listed them here. I won't read them out, but I'll go into detail, or I'll summarize each of those in a moment. But I think what is important is that we didn't just critique. We didn't just point out what was missing or what was wrong or what the issues were. We also offered solutions. Sorry, that was too fast. Before going into the key points, overall, we also reiterated an important critique. And it was a critique that had been done before, so it's nothing new that we pointed out. But we noticed once again that the treatment recommendations were solely based on the evidence derived from randomized controlled trials. And as was pointed out numerous times, this does not create sound policy. Sound policy requires that we draw on a diverse range of evidence, which includes the whole gamut of research studies, including qualitative studies, including case study evidence, including real-world data, especially in a country that has for years now collected real-world data within the IAP data set. As an example, all of this data that we have, and especially within that was collected within the NHS, all of this data was not included in this guideline, which we felt was utterly, we really didn't understand that. So NICE only focused on RCTs. In that, NICE did not adopt their approach and continued to follow an evidence-based practice approach based on medical science that aimed to identify the most important and most effective treatment. So in that sense, the aim really that the guideline committee had was to rank order treatment recommendations, to use a methodology that was meant to rank order treatment recommendations. And overall, they used a couple of analyses. So they looked at cost effectiveness. Sorry, they looked at clinical effectiveness, and they also looked at cost effectiveness. And between those two separate analyses, they derived the treatment recommendations with the aim to again rank order them and identify, especially the most effective treatment, followed by this, that, and the other. However, by doing that, it very much recommended a limited range of treatments, despite our knowledge that a one-size-fits-all model for mental health treatment is untenable. Moreover, research has shown time and again that about 50% of the patients benefit from one given treatment approach. Thus, it makes sense to offer a range of treatments for depression. But the guideline that we saw restricted offering helpful treatment and patient choice. So now I'm going to summarize the kind of more detailed methodological issues that we found. And our first issue, or first key issue, pertained to the categorization of depression. The categorization was out of line with US and EU guideline methodologies, sort of leading to erroneous and unhelpful classification of research studies, which did not match clinical or surface user experience either. So whilst the research committee has established 3 levels of sort of depression severity, sort of mild, moderate, and severe, NICE decided to very arbitrary in this guideline to divide the treatment populations, or the depression populations for first episodes into 2 levels, and they called them more severe and less severe. And that was completely arbitrary to our mind. So they used a method that has not been validated and has not been used anywhere else. So it was completely novel to do so. Furthermore, they also categorized the more severe aspects of depression, like chronic depression, treatment-resistant depression, or complex depression, which is depression with psychosis and depression with personality disorder. These were completely separated out. And the exclusion and inclusion criteria were set to be quite stringent. This led to arbitrary distinction of studies, and most importantly, this led to exclusion of evidence. Secondly, methods for determining treatment effects were inappropriate and discriminatory. So the method they used to work out whether a trial was found to be clinically significant were inadequate. So it only included full recovery for symptoms and ignored important partial recovery rates, for example. And again, important here is that it excluded important data. But it also, or mostly, it created a further disadvantage for those individuals suffering from more persistent, severe and complex form of depression. Because as you can imagine, the more severe a depression it is, you might wonder whether, having to achieve full recovery might just not be tenable and might be unrealistic. But studies that have, or findings that didn't show that, in that sense, weren't considered as being helpful, and were therefore didn't contribute to the variance of being counted as an effective treatment. For all analyses, a better and clinically more useful method would have been to look at individual change, for example, using the Reliable Change Index, but there are also other more clinically useful outcomes or rates that they could have used. The third point that we raised concerned the measurement time points, which we felt were inadequate. So the guideline focused on the end of treatment as the primary measurement point. But this, in a way, did not meet the principles of parity of esteem. So parity of esteem refers to the legal requirement as set out in the Health and Social Care Act for NHS bodies to give equal priority to mental and physical health. So for most physical health guidelines, actually, NICE looks or includes long-term follow-up. So for example, for the guideline for epilepsy and asthma, they examine treatment outcome data over a period between 1 and 10 years. So for us, it was completely puzzling why the evaluation of treatments for depression was not following the same quality standards. So they did not consider long-term effects of the treatments and hence recommended treatments that are not known to have a long-term effectiveness. But, for us, it seems like for anyone, it's imperative to kind of look at evidence that, that shows that the outcome of the treatment lasts. So it was very puzzling. Moreover, it was completely inconsistent with their own clearly stated aim of the draft document, and the aim, as I quote them, the aim of interventions is to restore health through the relief of symptoms and restoration of function, and in the longer term to prevent relapse. So they didn't really follow through their own aim by the methodology that they used. This also refers to the next point that we raised. Similarly, they didn't fall through, in which they only really focused on the relief of symptoms and not on the restoration of function. So they focused the primary measures they looked at and was on symptom outcome. And as we all know, or some of us know, symptom outcome does not reflect actually the service user preference, and it is limited. Most important are, other areas, quality of life, ability to deal with problems, being able to take care of oneself, so on. Loads of different variables that are more important to service users. But it is, in all fairness, not all studies will focus on these. So, in a sense, you have to include studies that also use these measures. So it's also a call for researchers to obviously use different measures and go away, move away from just focusing on symptom change. However, we looked at it and we found many studies since 2009 that included functioning and quality of life, and all of these data was ignored. The fifth concern were with the statistical analysis utilized. So statistical choices were made that are associated with serious and unique risks, and despite violation of underlying assumptions. And to our mind, that was serious and is critical. So the guideline used network meta-analysis, and I've provided a brief definition here on the slide. But network meta-analysis is still an experimental method, and many have argued that such an experimental method should not have been used or should not be used for such a complex data set. So there are, firstly, serious concerns and unique risks associated with network meta-analysis over and above that of standard meta-analysis that need addressing in any study using it. And when we looked at the data in detail, we found that they have not been adequately addressed or resolved. So that meant really that the resulting treatment recommendations were unreliable. And just to give you an example, one of the analyses concerning the less severe depression in itself, so that they obviously did several analyses for different groups. So they looked at the less severe depression for first-line treatment, and this particular network meta-analysis alone included 351 studies comparing 81 interventions and combination of interventions. And if you looked at these studies, they differed considerably in many, many variables. And just very briefly, those in the end violated the transitivity and the consistency assumption. And if that's the case, you have to be really careful, and you have to sort of, you have to, not only be transparent of this, which they didn't do in their first draft, but you also have to be careful in terms of what you recommend. And this is why some researchers point out that you should never do a network meta-analysis on its own, but it should always be accompanying more sort of standard meta-analyses. But I also wanted to point out something else, which is, I think, which relates to something called research integrity. And I kind of felt like before a novel measure can be used, a novel measure, a novel criteria, or a novel technique, it needs to undergo the usual rigorous validity and reliability tests carried out within the scientific community. And a treatment guideline isn't really the place to utilize a method that has not been thoroughly validated and approved by the scientific community. So even though NICE carries out their own analysis, they have their own team, and no doubt many of the teams are experts and know what they're doing. Simply, it isn't the place for experimentation, and shouldn't really be using their own methods, but should be using methods that have been approved by the scientific community. I won't go into much detail here, but the network meta-analysis had also a big impact on the economic analysis. Because they're both related, the network, the results from the network meta-analysis inevitably, impacted on the results of the economic analysis. Finally, evidence on service user experience was not reviewed and incorporated into treatment recommendations. So when I looked at, I kind of, I'm apologizing if this is a bit too small. I can't even read it, but it's basically a quote that I found on NICE's website that explains how one can register a stakeholder. And there's a statement that getting the patient's voice heard is crucial. However, one of the major critique points that we found with that treatment guideline was that within the guideline itself, the hundreds of published studies about the patient's experiences of the various treatments for their depression were completely ignored. So not only was the section on service user experience, which was in the 2009 guideline, not only was that not updated, but the critique at the 2009 guideline was already that the findings from that analysis weren't included in the treatment recommendations. It was sort of completely separate, which just didn't make sense. Why wouldn't these findings, these crucial findings, feed into the recommendation? Again, they didn't update that section at all. So we summarized these 6 methodological issues and some of the more general issues in our position statement, which I've provided a link here. You can look at in your own time later on and read all of these in a bit more detail. Coming back to the importance of this, according to World Population Review, 251 to 310 million people suffer from depression worldwide. So this is approximately 5% of the adult population. In the UK, just focusing on the UK, it is approximately 2.8 million people that are affected. So this surely calls for treatment guidelines that are methodologically sound and thus fit for purpose. So I was not only shocked when I saw the draft guidelines in 2017, but also actually extremely worried, knowing that a significant number of the UK population suffering from depression would not receive adequate help. So I felt I actually needed to do something. I felt I needed to do something more than just highlighting our concerns in a document which NICE might consider or might not consider. And of course, we did that. We highlighted all our concerns in the official way. But at the same time, I started approaching others to sort of say, okay, we need to do something about this. And we started a stakeholder campaign. The stakeholder campaign lasted for 5 years. And NICE ended it in May 2022, as I said earlier, when they'd published the guideline finally, despite our continued efforts to get them to make all necessary changes. In all fairness, we had the pandemic happening as well, but in all fairness, they were under a lot of pressure to update a guideline. At the same time, we had a bit of a back and forth, and I'll give you a bit of a breakdown of that in a moment. But most important was that, in a sense, this campaign wasn't about a quarrel between unhappy therapists, complaining that their particular treatment approach was not recommended. This campaign really was about serious methodological flaws and choices that were not science-based in our mind, or that were wrong, that led to biases, and that were leading to misleading treatment recommendations. So it had serious consequences. And to give you a sense, this slide summarizes our activities over these 5 years. And just to point out, whilst I was leading the campaign, it was supported by many individuals who did a stellar job and alongside me volunteered their time to call for an important change in our society. So, in July 2017, as I said earlier, we received the first draft, and it was the first consultation, or the consultation rather. And we read it, we found all, we responded adequately, we contacted other stakeholders, and we all together decided, it was 6 at the time, we all decided to kind of become a coalition and raise the same points, the same issues, because it was also known that if several organizations, several stakeholders raise the same issue, they can't ignore it. Whereas if one stakeholder makes a point, they have a get-out clause and sort of saying, well, there's 100 stakeholders involved, you're the only one making that point, it's obviously not as important. So we try to sort of encourage people to make the same points. We also formally requested a second consultation because we said, okay, this is serious. We definitely want to to see the changes, and we want to we want to be consulted again and see if they had addressed indeed all these methodological changes. Moreover, the organizations involved sort of said, well, this isn't fit for purpose. So if it is published as it is, we're not going to accept it. And the coalition consisted of, of all the psychotherapy organizations, many patient organizations, and so forth. So we definitely made it known that we weren't happy with it. We also briefed peers and MPs, and sorry, I can actually use 1 second. And use a laser point. So yeah, so we in December 2017, we briefed peers and MPs, and an early day motion was tabled, and several MPs and peers signed a cross-party letter to NICE asking to respond to our letter. So basically encouraging them, requesting from them that we get a second consultation. And that achieved something. So in April 2018, we were granted a second consultation. So they showed us the changes that they did. But to our surprise, none of the methodological issues that we raised were actually addressed. So some minor points were addressed, and many of the inconsistencies that we raised, and the transparency issues, all of this was changed. However, none of our methodological issues, which obviously were profound. So we started further campaigning. So in July 2018, we started the whole procedure again. We approached more stakeholders to join us and raise the issues, bring these to the fore, publish the issues. We approached MPs again and asked them to sign a second and write a second cross-party letter to the CEO of NICE. We also, in the summer of 2018, offered to meet with NICE, the executive of NICE, but also with the development group. And this was a good meeting. It was chaired by an independent methodologist. And during that meeting, we in detail explained our concerns. We in detail, explained what we felt needed to be addressed. We offered the solutions for the problems, and we had a discussion around it. The outcome of that meeting was that NICE committed to revise the draft properly this time. And this was an unprecedented achievement. So the draft was revised a third time, this time hopefully addressing all our concerns. And then in December 2021, we received that draft to be reviewed. And as I said earlier, this time they had addressed some of our issues, but not all of our issues. And that's important because we couldn't sort of bargain with them. And this is why we continued campaigning. Even though we were obviously very pleased and happy that some of the methodological issues were addressed, others weren't. And we pointed out from the very beginning that we felt all of these issues really needed to be addressed for this guideline to be absolutely fit for purpose. So we continued campaigning. We had another cross-party letter. We wrote to NICE. We kind of made a case to really address the remaining issues, but at that point NICE refused any more contact, and they published the guideline in May 22. So what were our achievements? The guideline is now much more coherent and transparent. There's a strong focus on personalized care and on the importance of service user choice and shared decision-making. For milder forms of depression, and that is a big change, it's an enormous change, but for milder forms of depression, antidepressant medication is not routinely offered any longer. But it is, as this picture shows, and apologies that this has come out so small, but as this sort of picture shows, antidepressant medication, which is here, is offered as part of a menu of other short-term psychological therapies and treatments. Moreover, instead of a couple of therapies recommended, as it would have been the case with the first draft, there is now a menu of treatment options for first-line treatments, both for the less severe and the more severe group. And this is, you know, if you're a commissioner, this is what you would see. This is in the guideline summary, you know, that you can, you know, you know, patient and referrer or GP most of the time can discuss the various options. And all of these options are possible. And what is important here is that our detailed scrutiny of the data throughout all of these consultation periods actually really highlighted, and we stressed that with NICE, that there is no statistical significant differences. All the differences that they had were negligible between the different therapies for this type of depression or for the first line treatment, and that needed to be stressed. So in a sense, they did not really have any cause to rank order any of these treatments. And any rank ordering of these treatments, at least from a clinical perspective, but also from a cost effectiveness, the differences too were negligible, would have been arbitrary. Although they couldn't help themselves to do some kind of form of hierarchy, as you can see, I mean, they kind of presented them in some sort of order, but that it is a circle. And, you know, in a sense, and also the text that they provide with it really shows or signifies that any of these short-term treatments were found to be helpful and are therefore offered, which is a huge achievement. So what remains to be addressed? So quite a few issues, really. So whilst I've sort of said they have addressed many of our requests, you know, some major ones remain. So, for example, they haven't included any other evidence in this analysis. They haven't included real-world data. They didn't include the IAB data set or other real-world data collected around the world. So they continue. These findings are based on RCT evidence. They continue to use this arbitrary categorization of depression, so that hasn't changed. And most importantly, the network meta-analysis also hasn't changed. Also, as I have pointed out, the interpretation of the results has changed, so in which we have sort of really highlighted that the differences are negligible and that the rank ordering isn't really in order. They did include long-term follow-up data, so they extended the time points to look at long-term follow-up beyond the end of treatment. Long-term, you know, I think it was 6 months after treatment, that was included. So that was a change. They also included data on or the recommendations on so the measures on quality of life and functioning. So that was another major achievement. In terms of the treatment, the method for working out treatment effect, that didn't change. They still looked at recovery range or recovery changes and not on clinically significant change. And they still use quite stringent inclusion criteria. I'm aware I can't really go into detail here, and I'm nearing the end of my talk, but all of this is also summarized elsewhere if you wanted to go into detail. But to point out, whilst it is a hugely changed draft, and you know, one worry remains with the more severe and complex form of depression. And I do want to point this out because these are already in a disadvantaged population in many respects, and this group is likely not to receive the most appropriate treatment following these recommendations in the draft at the moment. Finally, I'd like to point out that many of the guidelines, NICE guidelines, would benefit from the changes in the methodological issues that we raised. So not only the depression guidelines, and we really hope that stakeholders continue to take NICE into account and all work with them together. And of course, we really hope that NICE in the next iteration will really you know, pay attention to these and make the necessary changes and adapt these changes to the next iteration of the depression guideline, but also to other guidelines. So in conclusion, Never has a treatment draft guideline in the UK received so much scrutiny and detailed attention. But most important, it has shown how important stakeholder involvement is really in this process. And that if in a way, if we are working as a coalition, working together, we can actually achieve pivotal change. Thank you for your attention. And I also would like to express my gratitude and my admiration really for all my colleagues who were involved in the SPR working group, but also to all the stakeholder organisations representing thousands of service users in the UK, thousands of workforce in the UK, as well as all the MPs and peers who supported the campaign. And lastly, I also would like to thank NICE, or the NICE Guideline Development Group, for all the additional work they have done. And I'm very much aware that this wasn't an easy job, and being part of a development group isn't easy, and that took a long time. And none of the critique that we expressed, with the guideline was concerned any individuals involved. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh, thank you so much. What an absolutely fantastic talk. And what an absolutely fantastic piece of work. So I mean that was if my calculations are right, that was sort of 5 years of campaigning effectively, really, wasn't it? Because it wasn't just a piece of research, it was a full-on campaign.